This is learning session and I am Pradeep. In this session, we'll confront one of the most decisive questions for the existence of humankind, the question of disaster and disaster management. From a relief-centric approach, there has been a paradigm shift to disaster risk reduction. That is, which is also called a holistic approach. Pre-disaster issues of preparedness, mitigation, and prevention. Post-disaster ones like response, recovery, and reconstruction. The reason why we specifically discuss this topic over here is because it's part of UPSC Civil Services General Studies exam. Therefore, towards the end, we'll also discuss institutional framework and administrative structure for disaster management in India. An event refers to something which happens or takes place. Some of them occur naturally, others are human-induced or man-made. Some are planned, some are not planned. Walking, driving, or even watching this video is according to your plan. But all these are very simple things which are called just events. But coming to something which is of great importance to us, which is a hazard. Hazard is a potentially damaging phenomenon. A potentially damaging phenomenon which can pose a threat to humans, human population, or human society. That is, an event which may cause economic, physical damages or even threaten human life and well-being. That is a hazard. There is a small house or a hut very near to a river on one side and an unstable slope. So that hut is vulnerable. That's a very important term which we will see. So added on to heavy rain, which is a hazard, what we get or what is the result is a disaster of flooding. So it is actually vulnerability of that house added with hazard which leads to the final picture of disaster. Now, disaster may occur as a single event or even as a sequence. So in the case of something happening as a sequence, for example, an earthquake can lead to a landslide. It's quite possible. Goes and obstructs the flow of a river. It can well cause a flood. So, earthquake leading to a landslide, which leads to a flood. In this case, the earthquake is the primary hazard. Landslide and flood are secondary hazards, and they form a disaster chain. Now, just have a look at this chart. Earthquakes are seen as terrifying natural disasters because they strike in no time without warning. But many earthquakes happen every year. Annually, there are millions of earthquakes which take place in a year. But all of them don't cause death and destruction. Why? That may be explained by vulnerability. Because it's when buildings and physical structures crumble, they fall and cause death and disaster. As seen in this figure, moderate, minor, light earthquakes are millions in number. Whereas let's look at the top three, which is strong, major and great. Combined together, they are 1,500 in number. Vulnerability is defined as the extent to which a community, structure, service or a geographical area is likely to be damaged or disrupted by the impact of the hazard. Vulnerabilities increase the susceptibility of an area or a community to the impact of hazards. They can also be, in terms of the disaster management terminology, be coined as diminishing capacity or diminished capacity of a community to cope with the impact of the hazard. So coping is also an important thing. There are physical, economic, environmental factors and the coping capacity of this society, which are factors. The concept of vulnerability also explains why elements are affected differently to different risks and shocks, even though they face the same. Recent disaster statistics point to an increase in the number of deaths and injuries, even without a greater increase in the number of hazards which face them. So what is changing is the effect of disaster, or in other words, it is vulnerability which is changing. Some factors which affect human vulnerability are poverty, increased population, rapid urbanization, changes in way of life, environmental degradation, lack of awareness and information, war and civil strife also factors. But all these 7 are interrelated. There is also another kind of vulnerability which is called structural or physical vulnerability. It is the extent to which a service or structure is likely to be damaged or disrupted by the hazard. A building is said to be vulnerable to earthquake tremors if its construction lacks elements which would resist the effect of such tremors. Something which is at risk actually has 2 components, which is 1, the vulnerability, and 2, the hazard. It's a combination of these which lead to the risk. But risk in popular understanding is it denotes possibility. When it comes to a technical setup, it actually stresses more on the consequences, that is in terms of potential losses. So risk is what we are going to define in terms of potential losses. Risk is expected or anticipated losses from the impact of the given hazard. That is, it's a combination of probability of the event and the negative consequences, occurrence and losses. Look at this figure. It's a very simple diagrammatic representation of a hazard and vulnerability. The person standing over there is vulnerable, and the rock on top of the hill is a hazard. A hazard may turn out into a disaster if the vulnerability of the community is not properly addressed. But it's not divine intervention or act of God which results in a disaster. A combination of hazard, vulnerability and coping capacity. In addition to the short-term damages a disaster caused, that is lives lost, property destroyed, the long-term consequences are not clearly measurable. These losses impede human development, erode previously hard-won accomplishments of the society. In effect, it also compromises resources, not just for the current, but also future generations. A disaster is, unlike a hazard, an effect. A hazard is a potentially damaging phenomenon, but a disaster is an effect. It is defined as serious disruption of the functioning of the society, material, environmental, human losses which exceed the ability of the community to cope using their own resources. So there must be two conditions which must be met for something to be called a disaster. One is the effect and the other level. So the combination of the effect and the level which has to be beyond the coping capacity of the society, that is beyond the capacity of the community to cope using its own resources. There are different classifications of disasters based on origin, based on nature of onset. Based on origin, it's classified as natural and man-made. Based on nature of disaster, it's classified as rapid onset, slow onset disasters, etc. But according to UNISDR, there is no such thing called a natural disaster, but only natural hazards. As discussed earlier, a hazard may turn into a disaster if the vulnerability of the community is not properly addressed. And for that, we have disaster management.